Welcome to Property Justice Chronicles, where we expose the most outrageous real estate power grabs and the sweet revenge that follows. Today's story will blow your mind. It's about a tech mogul, a greedy HOA board, and the most epic property ownership revelation in legal history. I'm Daniel Chen, a software entrepreneur who sold my company for $47 million in 2019. After years of Silicon Valley stress, I decided to find somewhere peaceful to retire early and pursue my passion for sustainable farming and renewable energy projects. What I didn't expect was to become the center of the most bizarre HOA battle ever recorded. 3 years ago, I was browsing luxury real estate listings when I found what seemed like the perfect property. A modest but charming 4,000 square foot contemporary home sitting on 5 acres in Pine Ridge Meadows, an upscale planned community in North Carolina. The listing was surprisingly affordable at $850,000, especially considering comparable homes in the area were selling for over $1.2 million. The house was beautiful but understated, clean lines, lots of windows, solar panels, and a geothermal heating system. It sat on a hill overlooking the community, surrounded by mature trees and with a small organic garden already established. The property had everything I wanted: privacy, sustainability features, and room for the workshop and greenhouse I planned to build. What made the deal even more attractive was the backstory. The home had been built in 2018 by Dr. Margaret Williams, a retired environmental science professor who designed it as a showcase for sustainable living. Unfortunately, Dr. Williams had developed health issues that required her to move closer to her family in Florida, forcing a reluctant sale after just 2 years. During the purchase process, my real estate attorney, Sarah Mitchell, discovered something unusual in the property records. The land had a complex ownership history involving multiple parcels that had been consolidated over time. She assured me that everything was properly documented and legally sound, but mentioned that there were some interesting historical aspects to the property that she'd explain after closing. I was so excited about the house and land that I didn't press for details. Looking back, I should have been more curious about what interesting historical aspects meant. I moved in during the summer of 2021, thrilled to start my new chapter. The house was perfect, the land was gorgeous, and my neighbors seemed friendly. Pine Ridge Meadows was an established community of about 200 homes, with well-maintained streets, beautiful landscaping, and reasonable HOA fees of $150 per month. For the first 6 months, everything was ideal. I kept a low profile, working on my sustainable living projects and getting to know the area. I installed additional solar panels, expanded the organic garden, and began planning a small workshop for my woodworking hobby. My neighbors were polite and welcoming, and I felt like I'd found my perfect retirement sanctuary. The trouble started in early 2022 when the HOA board elections brought new leadership to Pine Ridge Meadows. The new president was Richard Blackwood, a retired corporate lawyer in his 60s who'd moved to the community the previous year. Blackwood was everything you'd expect from a power-hungry HOA president: pompous, controlling, and convinced that his legal background made him an expert on everything. Blackwood's first act as president was to conduct what he called a comprehensive compliance review of all properties in the community. Within 2 weeks of taking office, I received my first official communication from the new regime. Mr. Chen, the letter began, during our recent property inspection, we've identified several violations of Pine Ridge Meadows covenants, conditions, and restrictions that require immediate attention. The letter listed 8 alleged violations. My solar panels were non-standard equipment that hadn't been approved by the Architectural Review Committee. My vegetable garden violated landscaping guidelines that prohibited agricultural activities. My compost bins were unsightly structures, and my plan to build a workshop required special permits that I hadn't obtained. I was stunned. Dr. Williams had lived here for 2 years without any of these issues, and nothing about my property was dramatically different from when I'd bought it. I called the HOA management company to discuss the violations. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen," said the property manager, Linda Torres. "Mr. Blackwood has been very aggressive about enforcement since taking over. He's interpreting the CC and RS much more strictly than the previous board. But these solar panels were here when I bought the house. The garden has existed for years. How can things that were previously acceptable suddenly be violations?" Mr. Blackwood says that previous boards were too lenient and that is bringing the community back to proper standards. You can appeal these violations at the next board meeting. I decided to attend the monthly board meeting to address these issues directly. What I witnessed was shocking. Blackwood ran the meeting like a courtroom, with himself as judge and jury. Homeowners who tried to dispute violations were cut off mid-sentence, and appeals were dismissed without proper consideration. When my turn came to speak, Blackwood barely looked up from his papers. "Mr. Chen, your property presents multiple ongoing violations. You have 30 days to remove all non-compliant installations and return your landscaping to approved specifications." "Mr. Blackwood, these installations were here when I purchased the property. The previous owners lived here for 2 years without any complaints. What previous boards allowed is irrelevant. I'm enforcing the current standards as written in our governing documents. Can you show me specifically where solar panels and vegetable gardens are prohibited?" Blackwood's face reddened. "Are you questioning my interpretation of our legal documents? I've been practicing law longer than you've been alive. I'm simply asking to see the specific language that supports these violations. The meeting is not a debate forum. You have your notice. Comply or face fines." Over the following months, Blackwood harassment escalated dramatically. Every 2 weeks brought new violation notices for increasingly ridiculous infractions. My mailbox was 2 inches too far from the curb. My outdoor furniture was the wrong color. My car was parked in my driveway for more than the allowed consecutive days. Each violation came with mounting fines: $50 for the first offense, $100 for the second, $200 for the third, and so on. By autumn, I was facing over $3,000 in accumulated fines for violations that seemed designed purely to harass me. The breaking point came in October when I received a violation notice that took my breath away. According to Blackwood, my property was in violation of a setback requirement that mandated all structures be at least 75 feet from the community boundary. My house, he claimed, was only 68 feet from the property line and would need to be relocated or demolished to bring the property into compliance. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Blackwood was demanding that I tear down and rebuild my house because it was allegedly 7 feet too close to a property line that I wasn't even sure existed where he claimed it did. That evening, I called Sarah Mitchell, my real estate attorney, and read her the violation notice. "Daniel," she said after a long pause, "I think it's time we had that conversation about the interesting historical aspects of your property." Sarah came to my house the next morning with a thick folder of documents and a surveyor's map that she spread across my dining room table. "When you bought this property," she began, "I did extensive research into the land ownership history because there were some unusual elements in the title chain. What I discovered is, well, it's complicated." She pointed to the surveyor's map, which showed my 5-acre property outlined in red, surrounded by the Pine Ridge Meadows development. "Your land wasn't originally part of Pine Ridge Meadows. In fact, your property is much older than the surrounding development. This land was part of a 127-acre farm that belonged to the Williams family. No relation to Dr. Margaret Williams, who built your house." Sarah pulled out a series of historical documents. The original Williams farm was established in 1923. Over the decades, the family sold off parcels for various purposes, but they retained the hilltop where your house now sits plus several other key parcels scattered throughout what would eventually become Pine Ridge Meadows. She showed me a map from 1995 that showed the Williams farm as a patchwork of owned and sold parcels. When Pine Ridge Development Corporation wanted to build this community in 2015, they faced a problem. The Williams family still owned 13 separate parcels totaling about 47 acres scattered throughout their planned development. What happened to those parcels? Sarah smiled. "That's where it gets interesting. Old Thomas Williams, the last surviving family member, was in his 90s and living in an assisted care facility. He had no direct heirs, but he'd always been passionate about environmental conservation. When the developers approached him, he refused to sell to them directly." She pulled out a legal document that made my head spin. Instead, Thomas Williams sold all 13 parcels to the Pine Ridge Environmental Trust, a conservation organization, with specific instructions that the land could only be used for sustainable living demonstrations and environmental education. Okay, but what does that have to do with my property? Dr. Margaret Williams wasn't just any buyer, Daniel. She was the director of the Pine Ridge Environmental Trust. When she built your house, she was creating exactly what Thomas Williams had envisioned, a demonstration of sustainable living practices. Sarah pulled out another document. When Dr. Williams sold the house to you, she didn't just sell the house and 5 acres. She sold you the house and transferred her position as trustee of the Pine Ridge Environmental Trust. I felt my world shifting. Are you saying I'm saying you don't just own 5 acres in Pine Ridge Meadows, Daniel. You own 13 separate parcels totaling 47 acres scattered throughout the entire development. You own the community center land. You own the parks. You own the retention ponds. You own the land under the main entrance gate. I stared at the documents, trying to process what she was telling me. But how is that possible? How can I own land that other people built houses on? You don't own the houses, Sarah explained. But you own the land underneath them. Every homeowner in Pine Ridge Meadows has what's called a ground lease with the Environmental Trust. They own their houses, but they lease the land from the trust, which is now controlled by you. She showed me copies of every homeowner's deed, and there it was in the fine print, subject to ground lease agreement with Pine Ridge Environmental Trust. The monthly HOA fees that everyone pays, half of that money, $75 per month from each homeowner, goes directly to the Environmental Trust as ground lease payments. That's about $15,000 per month in income that you've been entitled to since you bought the property. I was speechless. I owned almost a quarter of the entire Pine Ridge Meadows development, including the land under Richard Blackwood's own house. Why didn't anyone tell me this when I bought the property? Dr. Williams had been managing the trust quietly for years. She never exercised her authority as landowner because she believed in letting the community run itself. When she sold to you, she assumed you'd continue that approach. The trust documents were included in your closing papers, but they were buried in about 200 pages of other documents. Sarah pulled out my original closing folder and showed me the trust documents that I'd signed without reading carefully. There was my signature, making me the successor trustee of the Pine Ridge Environmental Trust and the effective landlord of nearly 200 families. So what are my rights as the landowner? Sarah's smile turned predatory. Well, for starters, any violations of your sustainable living demonstration are actually violations of the Trust's conservation mission. The CC and RS that Blackwood keeps citing? They're subordinate to the trust agreement, which specifically protects environmental demonstration activities. She flipped through the trust documents. You have the right to approve or reject any changes to the community. You can modify the CC and RS unilaterally if changes support the Trust's environmental mission. And here's the best part. If the community fails to support the Trust's conservation goals, you have the right to terminate ground leases and reclaim the land. I felt a slow smile spreading across my face. Are you telling me I could theoretically evict Richard Blackwood from land that I own? In extreme circumstances, yes. But let's start with something more reasonable. I suggest we send Mr. Blackwood a letter educating him about the actual ownership structure of his community and the fact that his harassment of you is directly violating the Trust's mission. That afternoon, I walked through Pine Ridge Meadows with completely new eyes. The beautifully maintained common areas, the parks where children played, the retention ponds that prevented flooding, I owned all of it. The community center where Blackwood held his tyrannical board meetings was sitting on my land. More importantly, I realized that Richard Blackwood had been collecting fines and making demands based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually had authority in this community. He thought he was the king of Pine Ridge Meadows. In reality, he was a tenant who'd been harassing his landlord. Over the next week, Sarah and I developed a comprehensive strategy. We decided not to reveal the full extent of my land ownership immediately. Instead, we'd start by asserting my rights under the Environmental Trust and see how Blackwood responded to having his authority challenged. Sarah drafted a letter that was a masterpiece of legal precision disguised as reasonable correspondence. Mr. Blackwood, we are writing regarding the recent violation notices issued to Mr. Chen. After reviewing the property's legal history, we must inform you that Mr. Chen's property operates under a conservation easement managed by the Pine Ridge Environmental Trust. The sustainable living installations you've cited as violations are actually protected activities under the trust agreement that predates the HOA CC and RS. The letter went on to explain that any interference with the trust's conservation mission could result in legal action, and that the HOA's authority was limited when it conflicted with the trust's environmental goals. We sent copies of the letter to every board member and the property management company, along with relevant excerpts from the trust documents that proved my property's special status. Blackwood's response was swift and predictable. Within 48 hours, I received a furious phone call. Chen, I don't know what kind of legal games you think you're playing, but your fancy lawyer doesn't scare me. I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I know a bluff when I see one. It's not a bluff, Richard. My property has legal protections that you've been ignoring. There's no such thing as a conservation easement in Pine Ridge Meadows. I've reviewed every document related to this community. Have you reviewed the documents related to the Pine Ridge Environmental Trust? There was a long pause. What trust? The trust that holds conservation easements on multiple parcels throughout the community. I'd be happy to provide you with copies of the documents. Another pause. You're making this up. Richard, I'm trying to resolve this amicably. But if you continue to issue violation notices for protected conservation activities, we'll have to pursue other remedies. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of the legal realities. Check with your attorney if you need clarification. Blackwood hung up on me, but I knew he'd be making phone calls. A man with his ego wouldn't admit ignorance without a fight. Sure enough, the next board meeting was moved up by a week, and the agenda included a special session to address false claims regarding property ownership. Blackwood had decided to make this a public battle. I arrived at the meeting with Sarah and a briefcase full of documents. The community center was packed. Word had spread that there was going to be a confrontation between the new resident and the HOA president. Blackwood opened the meeting with a pompous speech about frivolous legal challenges and residents who think they can ignore community standards. He announced that the board had consulted with their attorney and confirmed that no special easements or trusts had any authority over HOA governance. Mr. Chen has attempted to intimidate this board with fabricated legal documents, Blackwood declared. Tonight, we're going to set the record straight and demonstrate that no one is above community standards. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up with a calm smile. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify the situation. I walked to the front of the room and set up a projector that Sarah had brought. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to show you some documents that I think you'll find interesting. The first slide was a map of Pine Ridge Meadows with 13 parcels highlighted in red. These red areas represent land owned by the Pine Ridge Environmental Trust. As you can see, they include the community center where we're sitting tonight, all the parks and common areas, the retention ponds, and the land under several dozen homes. Murmurs started rippling through the crowd. People were craning their necks to see if their properties were highlighted. The Environmental Trust was established in 1995 by Thomas Williams, whose family had farmed this land since 1923. When Pine Ridge Development Corporation wanted to build this community, Mr. Williams refused to sell directly to developers. The next slide showed the trust documents. Instead, he sold the land to a conservation trust with a specific mission: to demonstrate sustainable living practices and environmental stewardship. Every property owner in this community signed a ground lease agreement with the trust, whether they realized it or not. I could see Blackwood's face turning red as he realized where this was heading. When I purchased my home from Dr. Margaret Williams, I didn't just buy a house. I became the successor trustee of the Pine Ridge Environmental Trust. The room erupted in shocked conversation. People were pulling out their phones to look at their own property deeds. Mr. Blackwood, the land underneath your own home is owned by the trust that I now manage. The community center where you hold these meetings sits on trust property. The violation notices you've been sending me directly conflict with the trust's conservation mission, which takes legal precedence over HOA regulations. Blackwood stood up, his face purple with rage. This is preposterous. You can't just claim to own community property. I'm not claiming anything, I replied calmly. I'm simply explaining the legal reality that's been documented in county records for over 25 years. Sarah stood up and began distributing copies of the trust documents to board members. Every homeowner in Pine Ridge Meadows can verify this information by examining their own deeds. The ground lease language is clearly stated in every property transfer since the community was established. The meeting dissolved into chaos as neighbors began calling their real estate attorneys and property managers to confirm what they'd just heard. Board members were frantically flipping through the documents Sarah had provided, trying to find some flaw in our presentation. Blackwood tried to restore order, but his authority had evaporated. People were shouting questions about their property values, their ground lease obligations, and what this meant for the community's future. Finally, Tom Patterson, a respected longtime resident, stood up and called for quiet. Daniel, assuming what you're saying is true, what are your intentions? Are you planning to start evicting people or dramatically changing how this community operates? It was the perfect question, and I'd prepared carefully for it. Tom, I have no interest in disrupting anyone's life or changing the character of this community. Dr. Williams managed the trust quietly for years, allowing the HOA to handle day-to-day operations while ensuring that the community's development remained environmentally responsible. I looked directly at Blackwood. However, I will not tolerate harassment or violation notices for activities that are specifically protected under the Trust's conservation mission. My sustainable living installations aren't violations, they're examples of exactly what this Trust was created to promote. Martha Henderson, an elderly woman who'd lived in the community since it opened, raised her hand. What about our monthly HOA fees? If you own the land, why are we paying the HOA? The HOA fees fund community maintenance, landscaping, and administrative costs, I explained. But $75 of each monthly payment goes to the Environmental Trust as ground lease fees. That money has been accumulating in trust accounts for years, funding conservation projects throughout the region. Sarah added, the Trust has been supporting local environmental education programs, maintaining wildlife habitats, and funding renewable energy initiatives. It's been operating exactly as Thomas Williams intended. Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Even if this trust exists, it doesn't give Chen the right to ignore HOA regulations. Actually, Richard, Sarah replied, it does. The trust agreement specifically states that conservation and sustainable living activities take precedence over any conflicting community restrictions. Daniel's solar panels, organic garden, and workshop plans are all protected activities. She pulled out another document. Furthermore, as trustee, Daniel has the authority to modify community regulations that conflict with the Trust's environmental mission. If the current HOA leadership can't work cooperatively with the Trust's goals, the Trust has the right to appoint new community management. The implication was clear. Blackwood could be removed from power if he continued his harassment campaign. The meeting ended with the board agreeing to postpone all enforcement actions pending a full legal review of the trust documents. Blackwood left without speaking to anyone, his face still red with humiliation and rage. Over the next few weeks, the community buzzed with excitement and concern as people processed the revelation. Property values weren't affected. The ground leases were permanent and transferable, so ownership rights remained stable. If anything, the community's unique conservation focus made it more attractive to environmentally conscious buyers. The big question was what would happen with the HOA board. Blackwood tried to maintain his authority, but his credibility was shattered. He'd spent months harassing the one person in the community who actually had the power to remove him from office. The resolution came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after the community meeting, I received a certified letter from Blackwood's attorney, informing me that Richard Blackwood was resigning from the HOA board and selling his property to move closer to his adult children in Florida. The letter included a formal apology for the misunderstanding regarding my property rights and a request that the trust not pursue legal action against Blackwood personally. I was happy to agree. I'd never wanted to destroy anyone's life. I just wanted to live peacefully on my property without harassment. The community held new board elections, and Tom Patterson was voted in as president. The new board adopted a cooperative relationship with the Environmental Trust, establishing clear guidelines for sustainable living projects and environmental improvements. Today, Pine Ridge Meadows is thriving under this unique partnership between traditional HOA governance and environmental stewardship. Property values have increased as the community has gained recognition for its innovative sustainability programs. We've installed community solar gardens, established native plant habitats, and created educational programs that attract visitors from across the region. My own property has become a showcase for sustainable living, with a workshop I'd originally planned now serving as a demonstration center for renewable energy technologies. The organic garden has expanded into a community-supported agriculture program that provides fresh produce to dozens of families. Richard Blackwood learned the hard way that power trips and harassment campaigns can backfire spectacularly when you pick the wrong target. He thought he was dealing with just another homeowner who could be bullied into compliance. Instead, he'd been harassing his own landlord, someone with the legal authority to evict him from the community entirely. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of understanding your legal rights and the power of patient, strategic thinking when dealing with bullies. Blackwood's aggression and arrogance blinded him to the possibility that his assumptions about power and authority might be completely wrong. More importantly, I learned that with great power comes great responsibility. Owning nearly a quarter of an entire community isn't just about legal rights, It's about stewardship and building something positive for everyone involved. Today, when new residents move to Pine Ridge Meadows, they're informed about the community's unique structure and conservation mission from the beginning. There are no more surprises, no more power-hungry board members making decisions without understanding the legal framework they're operating within. The trust continues to generate income that funds environmental projects throughout the region, exactly as Thomas Williams intended when he refused to sell his family's land to developers. His vision of sustainable living and environmental stewardship is thriving in ways he probably never imagined. And Richard Blackwood. The last I heard, he was living quietly in a regular suburban neighborhood in Florida, hopefully having learned that assuming you know everything about property rights can be a very expensive mistake. Sometimes the best revenge against bullies isn't fighting back, it's simply revealing the truth about who actually has the power.